I am Nicoletta Pireddu, the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative, and it's a pleasure for me to open the second presentation in our Faculty Work in Progress series. Our hope with this initiative is to create an intellectual space, unfortunately a virtual one for the moment, in which humanities faculty can share their current research activities and engage in a dialogue with colleagues. You're all welcome to present your work, and actually we're currently planning for the spring semester, so whoever is interested in participating can contact me to coordinate. I wish to give a warm welcome to our presenter today, Sara Omar. Sara is assistant professor and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. She holds a PhD from Harvard University and recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship in Middle East Studies at Yale. She has received numerous fellowships, among them a Fulbright for fieldwork in Syria on female religious authority in Damascus. Her interests are in Islamic intellectual history, the Quran and its exegesis, Islamic law, gender and sexuality, religious authority, and religion and violence. The topic of her talk today is gendering sex in pre-modern Muslim discourses. It is part of her book Manuscript in Progress, which underscores insights that can be gained from studying same-sex sexual practices to understand the legal, ethical, and social genealogies that have authorized various practices and beliefs as authentically Islamic, while also disqualifying and silencing others. I wish to thank Professor Judith Tucker for kindly agreeing to be Sara's respondent today. Judith is professor of history and author of numerous articles, co-edited volumes, and monographs on the history of women and gender in the Arab world. Some titles: Women in 19th Century Egypt, In the House of the Law, Gender and Islamic Law in Ottoman Syria and Palestine, Women, Family and Gender in Islamic Law. She is currently working in a different but equally fascinating domain right now, the history of piracy in the Mediterranean in the 17th and 18th centuries. So we hope, Judith, you can share your ongoing research with us in our series very soon. After Sara's presentation, Judith will offer her comments and engage in a brief conversation with Sara. We will then open up the discussion with the audience, so please submit your questions through the Q&A function because we have disabled the chat. Thank you all for being with us, and now, Sara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Nicoletta Pireddu. I truly appreciate the opportunity that you've given me to present and share my ongoing work, and also the time that you've put in to coordinate and organize everything. I know how much time and effort that takes, so thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen and hope that it is viewable by all of you. Is that okay? Yes, visible. So this is part of a larger project. I shared one chapter with Professor Tucker, and it is a new and recently added chapter to the project, and it's still a draft, and so it's still developing and ongoing. But this is part of a larger project where I look at same-sex sexual practices in early and classical Muslim discourses, roughly from the 7th to the 14th century. So a very, very large chunk of time, but it's also an understudied period on this topic. What I attempt to do in this project, and again, it's sort of, I've edited and re-edited and still sort of working on it. But what I try to do in this topic is to try and complicate the ways in which we understand Islam by using this specific subject as a case study. And I do this through looking at different genres, different discourses, really a wide variety, and looking within them, looking across them, looking at things such as Islamic law, looking at hadith, Quranic commentaries, medicine, natural philosophy, really a wide range of genres and fields of studies in order to try and understand the way in which Muslims discuss this topic, but also debated and really had a wide range of ways of having a conversation about it. And I do this as a way of getting us past, and I know others are doing this, so I'm not the only one, and I'm not claiming to be the only one to do this, but getting us to think past a monolithic historical Islam, or even a modern monolithic Islam. And so it's an attempt to highlight the diversity of discourses on a topic which is perceived in very divisive ways in contemporary Muslim discourses and even academic discourses. So there tends to be two perceptions about this subject, right? One is that Muslims have historically condemned same-sex sexual practices. It's a monolithic history, really a uniform history, and it's all there and clear and cut, and there's no need for any more discussion or conversation. And then on the other hand, you have sort of the more Orientalist academic discourses that depict it as Muslims, sort of a negative portrayal of Muslims as really being licentious and open and engaging in all sorts of sexual practices that that they perceived as taboos. And so you get these sort of polarized ways of presenting this topic. And again, I like to, or I'm attempting to highlight the nuances. So that's the larger project. This particular chapter, which I shared with Dr. Tucker, is one that serves as the first chapter of the monograph. It sort of sets the scene and discusses and examines frameworks, structures, and definitions. And so I called it Gendering Sex because any work that you pick up, classical works from this early period that you pick up that discusses same-sex sexual practices, what one will quickly realize is that it's always discussed within and in relation to sex, as in sexual intercourse. There's almost an obsession with the penetrative act itself, right? That this is the central act that everyone wants to know more about. And wants to discuss punishing in what ways, or, but the conversations are being had around the central, acts, physical acts. So I began to think, and as I've been developing this, I was thinking about how sex is defined, right? So if they connect it to sex, how is sex defined? I think this might strike some of us as sort of, a very sensical, straightforward answer, but anyone in gender and sexuality studies knows that these things are a little bit more complicated. And so as I dug deeper, some of the questions I asked, I posed on the slides, and I'm not going to read them, but again, I wanted to know how Muslim jurists, Muslim scholars historically have constructed and defined sex, in order to understand how they understood these particular sexual acts between men and between women. And so these are the questions I began to ask. And I quickly realized that, that there was something happening in the way in which they're defining sex. And it was a very polarized way of defining sex. It was very physical. It was along the axis of penetration. It was extremely phallic, right? So without a phallus, there is no sex, there is no penetration. And that in itself informs the way jurists and others discuss and have a conversation about same-sex sexual practices and acts across the board. And so in essence, or ultimately, jurists specifically define sex as the penetrative act, penetrative act, which is really distinguished by roles, right? So who does what to whom is one way of thinking about it. And so the penetrative active act is done by those who are men and adult, free men, adult males. And the recipients of the sexual acts, of course, could be anybody, but when we're talking about heteronormative sort of constructions, we're talking about men and women having sexual relations with one another. And in that context, it's a man penetrating a woman, right? Vaginally, and then you get discourses and debates about whether anal penetration also fits into the same sort of category of zina or illicit sexual intercourse. So not only is the way they define it very phallocentric and really along gendered lines, but also the language they use. And anybody who's familiar with the Arabic language will quickly realize that the verbs that are used for what we might think of as nouns or verbs for, the word sex, they in themselves are also gendered. And so, the words in Arabic, and there's different words that are used, ijma' or wat or nikah, all of these words they designate an act that is happening to somebody else, right? It is not something that people do together. When we think of sex, we think of it as an act that is done with someone, with a partner. It is something that one does to somebody else, right? It takes on a direct object. And so even the language itself is very gendered, and it implies this dichotomy, clear-cut, sort of man does something to woman or man does something to somebody else. A woman cannot possibly physically penetrate another woman, right? And so this is sort of the framework. Also, as you look at, or as one examines the historical discourses, what also becomes apparent is that this is part of a larger sort of social structure. It's part of a larger legal conversation that's being had. And it's one which is really deeply rooted in hierarchical differentiations, right? There's differentiations between Muslim and non-Muslim. There's differentiation between able bodies and disabled bodies. There are differentiations between free and slave. There are differentiations between adult and minors or children, right? And the list goes on and on. There's differentiation class-wise between those who are elite educated and those who are lesser educated. And so, as you know, and this could be applied to any subject. I just happen to apply it to this specific discursive word of sex, but you could do this with any other issue, such as female leadership, for example, leadership and who the imamate belongs to, who should be leading at the head of the congregational prayers. So you could really apply it to any other issue. I just so happen to choose this one, which applies to the larger book project that I'm working on. And so when you begin to examine these specifically legal discourses about punishments, what becomes apparent quickly is that the punishments were, you have disagreements over what the punishments should be, depending on the sexual act that is taking place. So that's a given. But as you dig deeper into the details, what you find is that they're very much hierarchical, and they're very much dependent on who is doing what to whom. Age is an issue, gender is an issue, sex is an issue, social status is an issue, all of it is an issue. And so I put up this simple pyramid, and it may not be, I fiddled with this, and I've been trying to figure out how to capture what it is that I'm trying to convey. And you end up having, I placed it in a pyramid because this is sort of how I'm thinking about it. Free adult men tend to be sort of the most privileged socially, the most privileged, but also the most legally accountable, right? So you get this sort of double-pronged thing where those who are most privileged are also the most responsible. They are the ones who are most accountable. They are the ones who are most severely punished. And as you go down the scale, or this pyramid that I've put up here, what you find is that depending on the individual's status within this social hierarchy or this socio-legal hierarchy, you end up having different punishments to varying extents and varying degrees, depending on who one was. And there's really all sorts of very detailed scenarios, which I will not get into, but of who is doing what to whom, whether a minor is penetrating an adult free woman, whether a free adult woman is being penetrated by an adult male, whether a free woman and a free woman are both adults having sexual relations together. Really, like, all of these different stratifications and different factors play a huge role in the outcome and the punishment, and how one is not only punished, but also socially how one is perceived, right? What the sort of the sexual act, how it's socially perceived as well. Again, I'm not going to get into any of these, but I just wanted to put this table up here to give you a sense of how detailed and how much attention jurists and Muslim scholars gave to each of these different elements and different factors that went into constructing what sex was and how to punish all of these different acts by different actors or different individuals involved as objects of the sexual act. I wanted to just give you a general sense of not only how sex is defined and how this socio-legal system shaped the way in which individuals and acts were treated, but also the way in which sex roles really play a significant role in, again, how one is socially perceived and how one is legally punished. And so I put on here, is it 5 different scenarios or 5 different roles that individuals may have played and how these are perceived socially and legally. So I'm going to begin with the first one, which is the passive penetrated adult female. And this is really an interesting one. And I start with this one because this is the one that got me thinking about the way in which the construction of gender and the way in which sex is actively being gendered as a process. And so when I began this research, I was really struck by the fact that women were depicted as the passive recipients of sexual acts. And, you know, again, it may be sort of something that others may have known, or, you know, it's something that isn't all that enlightening. But for me, it was really eye-opening to think about if they view women this way, then maybe there are parallels to be drawn between the way in which they view passive women as well as the way in which they view passive men, i.e. those who have things done to them. And so this sort of got me thinking on this, in this path. And so the way in which women are presented, and again, this is not monolithic. There are many variations depending on the school, the legal school, depending on the jurist within or across legal schools, you'll get different understandings and different positions on this. But there is sort of a longstanding position in the Hanafi school where you have, again, the jurist punishes a woman's, again, and a free adult woman is dependently punished based on who is penetrating her. So if it's a free adult Muslim male penetrating her, then that constitutes, outside the marriage relationship, obviously, then that constitutes illicit sexual relations. It constitutes zina. And she, along with him, they're both punished through, depending on their status and all these other factors, whether they've been previously married or not, they're punished with the capital punishment of had. However, what's more interesting is she is not punished if she is being penetrated by a young boy and or by someone who is whose sanity is in question, right? So again, her punishment is dependent on who is penetrating her and their status, social, you know, legal, and you could think of this along the lines of in the legal discourses, it's taklif, right? Who is a mukallaf, who has the legal capacity to be punished in certain ways. And so to my mind, again, as sort of a contemporary modern reader, I was struck by the fact that, you know, an adult-free woman is not being held accountable based on her own actions, which may be counterintuitive to what we know about Islamic law. She is instead punished, and her punishment is dependent on who is penetrating her. And so this is really an sort of a shift in how things, how we might think of things. And you have different language that is very, very explicit used by certain jurists. And it's one that is very gendered, one that depicts her as someone who is, you know, she is not someone who actively is a zania, which is contradictory to the Quranic verse itself, right? The Quranic verse refers to males and females who commit illicit sexual intercourse as zani was zaniyatu, right? The female, the feminine and the masculine. Yet this discourses in the legal tradition point to her, or some discourses in the legal tradition point to her as a mazniyan biha, right? The one who is done to. She is the one who is penetrated and is the one through whom zina is accomplished. And then you have this other scenario, which fits in line with the larger project of same-sex sexual relations. And this one, again, if if we think about this larger framework of hierarchy, if we think about this larger framework of sex as penetrative, then this fits in perfectly, and it makes perfect sense why they wouldn't punish female-female sexual acts as sex, right? It is female-female sexual acts. Grinding, sihaq in Arabic, is not referred to as zina. It is not referred to as illicit sex. It is not defined as sex. It's seen as potentially something that that can be equated to what men and women do outside of sex, not sex. So female-female sexual practices are not sex. And because of that, they're not punished in the same way as sex or illicit sex, zina, the zina model. And so you have very explicit language that points to the reasoning behind this, right? And I just gave a couple of examples of Maliki jurists who use certain language to point to the fact that a woman is incapable of incapable of physically, phallically penetrating another woman. Therefore, this is not sex. Therefore, the punishment looks very different. It's disciplining, it's ta'zir, it's discretionary punishment. It is not the standard capital punishment that's used for illicit sexual relations between men and women. Another example, and this is sort of where things get interesting, is when we think about the active penetrator who is an adult male. So the active penetrator, the adult male, is the one who sets the standard, right? This is sort of the epitome of intercourse, the epitome of sex. And the active adult male is presumed to be dominant, is presumed to be acting in accordance with what was normally expected of him in terms of roles, in terms of capacity, in terms of what he does to others, right? So he fits in line with social expectations, legal expectations. Of course, he is intended to penetrate only women, but in the case that he penetrates others, socially, and you get this from literary texts and poetry and other depictions that are not legalistic, socially, he is not disparaged. He's not seen as acting outside of his sexual role. If anything, some scholars have argued that he is even hyper-valorized, right? That he can penetrate anybody. He doesn't only penetrate women, he could penetrate anybody, and he's still acting as a man. He is not acting in any other way. And so, so this is sort of the standard by which he is abiding by his social role. And of course, the legal discourses get complicated, and there are punishments for engaging in illicit sexual acts outside of the marital relationship. But interestingly, the way in which he's discussed and really depicted is sort of this valorization, which fits into earlier Hellenic discourses. It's very much in line with that. This particular role of the passive penetrated adult male tended to be the most problematic. It tended to be the one that was really, I want to say there's almost an obsession with this particular role, that you tend to have this focus on why it is that an adult male who sits at the top of this hierarchy would even think of or consider allowing himself to be penetrated like a woman. How on earth could somebody do this, right? Extremely sort of perplexing for these jurists and for Muslim scholars. Again, you've been granted the top of the hierarchy, you've been granted this privilege, and you are willingly saying, I want to be penetrated. I don't want to remain in my sexual role of being a penetrator. And so you get all sorts of hadiths or prophetic traditions that sort of use certain languages to describe those who are penetrated, especially the adult men who are penetrated. There's one particular hadith that I've listed here that where somebody sends a letter to Abu Bakr, the first caliph and the Prophet's close companion and father-in-law, where they ask him what to do with a man who was found being penetrated like a woman. Like, it's really like there's a direct parallel there. What do we do with this man who is being penetrated like a woman, i.e. the passive adult male? And then you get different responses, and it's a whole thing within itself. But I put it here just to give you, again, this general sense of the way in which there's direct parallels in again, roles, right? So if you occupy the passive role, you then, as an adult male, are behaving like a woman. You don't become a woman, but you behave in a way that women behave. And then you get Fakhruddin Razi, who also uses specific language to describe what is acceptable and what is not acceptable of adult men as opposed to adult women. And obviously, again, allowing oneself to be penetrated as an adult male is the absolutely most taboo thing you could do socially. One last one, and I'm done. This last example is of the passive penetrated young boy, which some of you might be more familiar with. This is sort of the role that really features heavily in Arabic poetry of different generations and different time periods. But interestingly, when we think about the passive penetrated young boy, again, all of these acts are legally prohibited. This is not the question that I'm examining. I'm curious to see the way in which these individuals and these roles are depicted. And so a young beardless boy was seen as, as sort of on par with women, that just like women are beautiful and desirable, so too are these young, beautiful, beardless boys desirable. And this is natural, right? Like you get this discussion and conversation, which is a different chapter that I look at, of what is natural and what is unnatural, right? Like what is, and so you get different words, but what is, according to one's fitra, what is this inclination that we're predisposed to? Boys as an object of desire are seen as a natural object of desire, that it doesn't seem unnatural to be sexually attracted to them, that this is natural. And this is like of the most classical jurists who use this language, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Ibn Taymiyyah, you name it, that there's sort of this naming and usage of this language to describe them as naturally desirable. But there's also all these parallels that, that sort of position them in the same way that you would describe women, right? And so it's interesting to see the ways in which, again, roles and sex are depicted and are gendered, really. And so you get all sorts of conversations. There's Al-Jahid has a famous epistle where he compares young boys to slave women, right? And who is more virtuous, and what are the virtues of this one as opposed to this one? It's sort of a competition of who should win out, who's more desirable. And so this is, again, you could dig it up and it's there, but they were seen and depicted as naturally, often, not always, but often, as naturally desirable objects for one's sexual attraction. So it was perfectly normal socially anyways to desire a boy and to want to engage in sexual relations with them as an adult male. So I'm going to conclude, and I just wanted, again, this is very brief, and I didn't pre-circulate the chapter, so you did not get a chance to read what I wrote. The point of this chapter and what I'm trying to do is really to think about the ways in which Muslim scholars during this very large period of time thought about, and the way in which they think about gender, think about sex, define sex, but also use their own normative gendered notions and understandings of society, and the way in which they structure the legal discourses, and not just in relation to sex and gender. I mean, again, this could be applied to any other issue, but really the way they use sex as a way of gendering sexual relations, and then ultimately offering different punishments and different social perceptions of individuals based on this single private act of sexual relations. Okay, I stop here, and sorry if I took too long.
Thank you so much, Sara. Now, Professor Tucker is welcome to offer her comments.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Professor Omar, also for, I had the privilege of reading this chapter, so which I very much enjoyed. And I thought it really offered some wonderful new insights into the relationship between specifically social and legal hierarchies of difference, and the way in which Muslim scholars, in fact, as in Sara's words, gendered sex, that is mapped social hierarchies onto sexed bodies. And Professor Omar, in this chapter I read, she basically argues that this gendering of sex holds a key to our understanding of how and why jurists developed the legal norms that differentiated among these sexual transgressions and ordered up punishments accordingly. And so I really found this a new and very revealing approach to thinking about how the discourses of pre-modern Islamic legal texts were reflecting and shaping power relations in their societies, and perhaps most forcefully so when it came to the rules for sexual acts. Well, that's a question I want to raise with her. And so I did especially appreciate the ways in which Sara walks us through these, what she sees as 12 different types of illicit sexual intercourse, distilled from her obviously very wide reading of the jurists, and makes her case that the definition and punishment of sexual transgression has everything to do with the social position of the perpetrator. And I was completely persuaded, I must say. And I would just say, in general, I think the field of Islamic law and society has struggled over time to really marry legal history to social history. And I think this approach of Professor Omar's is actually giving us a new way to think about this and a new kind of road into it. So I really appreciated that. So there's several areas I'd like to ask Professor Omar to enlarge upon. We may not have time for all of them, and I am mindful of the fact that we want to reserve some time also for our audience. So let me, without further ado, get right into it. And so the first question I want to raise is as you read this chapter, there's a certain irony operating here, because in a way, those at the top of the social hierarchy, that is the adult Muslim males, who are the penetrators, are the most severely punished, actually, right? And they're the ones that are least likely to be able to kind of wiggle their way out of punishment. So it kind of seems an inversion of the hierarchy, the social hierarchy. And how do we understand that inversion? Why does sex, the illicit sexuality, why do the penalties fall most heavily on the most privileged? And do we understand it in relation to the extraordinarily high standards of evidence that we know rendered zina so unlikely to be prosecuted, and kind of more or less guaranteed that this crime had largely symbolic significance? Or maybe because sex acts are being surveilled and punished in other spaces, that is, in more private domestic space, where the less powerful women and boys actually face much more serious repercussions than they do in the formal legal discourse. And of course, Professor Omar is very careful to say in this chapter that this discourse is not necessarily about lived realities, as we all know, but at what point do the lived realities in this case, if they're at odds with the discourse, do they undermine or counterbalance the jurist constructions? So that's just the first question I'd like to throw out there and get Professor Omar's response.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tucker, for just even taking the time to read the chapter and think about it and come up with questions and being here. I think you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought of the inversion of the hierarchy by placing males at the very top. And so I'm sort of at a loss trying to figure out how to address that. I do think, I think you're absolutely right in making the observation. I guess for me, I was thinking more legalistically of, if someone is given the most privilege, then they're also the most responsible as a human being, that you can't have all this privilege and think you could get away with things. And so to me, that sort of was just how I thought about it. And I hadn't thought of the inversion of the hierarchy. So I have to give that some more thought and figure out how to sort of come to terms with that, or what to do with that. In terms of lived realities and the social context as opposed to the juridical discourses, this is really, as you pointed, is sort of a really difficult field and a very difficult area. And it's one that I've struggled with as well, especially for the earlier period, right? For maybe the Ottoman period and later periods, you have a little bit more court records and things that you can actually examine to figure out what was happening on the ground and do some more social history. For the 8th and 9th century, there are no, at least not that I could find or that I'm aware of, court records or things that you could take a look at to really figure out, how many cases were persecuted, how many prosecuted, how many cases were raised, or it's difficult to measure. So my way of sort of remedying that was to look at as wide as possible of range of conversations, discourses, and genres, to see, maybe piecing all of these different ones together, maybe we can come up with a depiction, a representation, or representations of what was happening. And so the discourses absolutely do not reflect the realities on the ground. And I do think you're right that those who are lesser in that hierarchy are obviously treated in very different ways, whether the law is intending to protect them or not. They are on the ground being treated in very different ways, and they're the most vulnerable. But I think legally, if we're following just the legal discourses, again, you tend to have, and my way of sort of thinking about this is maybe, it may have had to do with the fact that jurists are setting, and so pointing to your maybe first answer to your own question, but it may have been that the jurists were obviously trying to construct a legal system by which they can manage and structure society. And so one way to do this is to really scare people out of engaging in these relations, whether it's between men, between women, between men and women, whoever it may be. It will be severe. The punishment is terrible, but we're going to also set certain standards and conditions to make sure that not everybody's just getting punished left and right. But the intention isn't punishment. The intention is deterrence, and they don't want people engaging in these relationships. So from what I read and what I've read and what I've seen, it seems that this is sort of their attempt at creating and constructing rules, systematic, or maybe sometimes not systematic, but at least an attempt to construct a systematic structure to social and order society, or order a social society. And so, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a difficult one to answer. And yeah, I'll think about the other component and give it some more thought as well.
Okay, thanks so much. And okay, so maybe I'll just ask one more question in the interest of allowing a little space for other people. But, and that really has to do with, I know you suggested that there's a certain randomness to your choice of sex as the site for Muslim jurists' elaboration of sociocultural norms. And, but still, I found that it's an interesting choice. And I think, the feel I got in the chapter was you also think it's a pretty important choice, right? If not a privileged site for us to explore this particular question. So the question that came to me by way of contrast, one could argue that the lack of access to the ownership and management of property, for example, in many European legal systems, that was probably the most important for signaling women's inferiority, as well as social hierarchies of different kinds, right? So I was struck by the question, kind of why in Islamic jurisprudence did the jurists gravitate towards what is ostensibly a more private matter, rather than simply focusing more on indications of power that could be legible in the public sphere, right? So, or hierarchical frameworks that gendered the status of women and minors within the family itself, but didn't deal with sex per se.
Yeah, no, thank you. And, again, I am not the first or the only person to do this. You yourself you've worked on marriage and divorce and family laws. And so you've done this very well. And Keisha Ali has done this with her book on marriage and divorce and slavery. I think Marian Katz right now is currently working on a project that sort of does a similar thing with the house and housework. And so I chose sex, I hadn't chosen sex. Honestly, like initially I was just thinking of same-sex sexual relationships and sexuality and what was happening and how did they think about them. But the more and more I read, the more and more I realized that this is, not only is it something that hasn't been used as a focus for constructing gender, but it really captures their gendered perceptions. If you think about the way they define sex, it is physical, it is phallic, it is like in your face, unavoidable. If you think about the way in which they even gender bodies, right? Like I don't do this in this book, but it's something else that I'm working on when I'm thinking of intersex bodies and the way in which they sex them, right? Like, is this a male? Is this a female? What should it be? We don't know what to do with this body. It's ambiguous. It's unknown. What do we do with it? So I feel like the most private components and aspects of one's body and the way in which the jurists discussed and defined bodies is really a great lens through which to examine their own perceptions of bodies and gender. And I couldn't get away from it. I mean, this is an added chapter that I just recently added because I felt like, how did I miss this all along? Like, I need to include something about sex as a way through which it is very clear that they're gendering acts, they're gendering bodies, they're gendering and treating different sexual activities and acts in different ways. But yes, I mean, others can and have applied similar things to other issues, and this is not exclusive. I just happen to think that sex, even though so private, is really just a very clear indication of the way in which they gender the sexual act itself, but also sex, the human body itself, which I think is really an interesting sort of perspective that hasn't been given much attention to.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I could go on because I have many things I'd like to engage, but I'm going to do it as a side conversation with you and allow other people to ask questions. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. If our webinar host allows us to stay a little bit longer and the audience can also stay, I would like to address the questions that came through the Q&A that are very interesting, and maybe Sara can answer them at least synthetically. One asks whether jurists take into consideration for punishment or not whether the actor was drunk. Here there is an overlap between someone not having mental capacity and the dominant view that nevertheless the actions of drunks fall within Taclif. Maybe I read all of them, and then maybe you can address issues that can somehow answer more than one. Comment from Julie, very interesting, thank you. A lot of this sounds quite similar to the way in which sex is seen and conceptualized in Greco-Roman culture. So do you, Sara, see overlap, and how might we conceptualize this relationship historically? Regarding today, is with a slow but steady shift in the understanding of women's roles in society, do you know whether there is a shift in understanding sex